Okay, I can read the note from Brother Ivan now. Thank you very much for the nice plant. It was a real pleasure to be greeted by it upon our arrival back home. We are truly grateful, as well as to be able to tune in to the chapel memorial service and our Lord's hope, Brother Ivan. Brother Ivan, my apologies for the blunder on my part, but I hope you're getting better if you're tuning in today. So thank you for the note, and glad you're doing better. We have Brother Nicolas Pratt, who will speak to us this morning, and his subject is God's weather, which we have experienced quite a bit here in this last month. And he's asked that we read Acts 27, 23 through 44. It's Acts 27, 23 through 44. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be given, even as it was told me. Howbeit, we must be cast upon a certain island. But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country, and sounded and found it at 20 fathoms. When they had gone a little further, they sounded again, and found it 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern, and wished for day. As the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea, under color, as they that would have cast anchors out of the foreship, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, Except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall away. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, This day is the 14th day which you have tarried, and continued fasting, having taken nothing. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. For there shall not be a hair fall, an hair fall from the head of any of you. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread, and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. When he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all of good cheer, and they all took some meat. We were all in the ship, in the 216 souls. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea, and loosed the rudder bands, and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind, and made towards shore. And falling into a place where 2 seas met, they ran the ship aground, and 4 parts stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. Let us now turn our attention to Brother Nicolas. Again, his subject this morning is God's weather.
Good morning, everybody. It's a beautiful day outside. It's nice to see all of you here. Casey, I didn't talk to you about the hymns, but so far your two hymns fit perfectly in with my exhortation, so thank you. I had never sung that second hymn. We all sounded quite nice on that. So lately, we've been seeing some pretty interesting weather here in Richmond, as well as across the country. Not necessarily as intense weather here as some places, and we haven't had hurricanes and huge floods or rainstorms, but it's been pretty dramatic temperature swings. Fortunately, these last couple of days especially have been beautiful, so it's nice to get back outside, kind of get some fresh air there. But some of the drastic swings, so a couple of days before Christmas on December 23rd, it was 71 here, which you guys probably remember, which is only 2 degrees less than the record temperature for that day. So really, really nice and warm day, and enjoyable to spend that outside. However, then on January 7th, we hit a low of -3, which isn't terribly cold for anybody that's not from here. If you're from anywhere north, -3 isn't that terrible, but for Richmond, that's the coldest it's ever been on a January 7th since the late 1800s, when they started taking weather, and it's the coldest it's been at all in Richmond, below in the negatives for the last 18 years. And the last time it got any colder than -3 was in 1985. And that was -6. So -3 is really cold for here, but that's nothing compared to my parents in central Illinois. They had 3 record-setting days for the time that weather's been recorded. January 1st, 2nd, and 6th, it was -15 there with a wind chill of -35. And central Illinois gets really cold, but it's not like the Arctic tundra, but it did feel like that. So anyway, it's been really cold, really warm, kind of have a lot of swings lately. And we don't have control over that. Now we do have some control. We have, say we need to recycle, like we have emissions. There are things that humans are affecting, whether you look at the Dust Bowl in the 20s and 30s, where people over-farmed, you have pollution and smog, which are causing problems. But generally, we don't have actual control over the weather. We don't have a way to say, well, I need it to rain the right amount, and we can fix that. And we've seen that lately. We've seen lots of dramatic changes all over the world in the last 10, 15 years especially. But we don't have control, but God does. And Job is a wonderful book that we see all sorts of discussions on God. And so that's kind of where we're going to be looking mostly today, because there's a lot of really wonderful imagery of how God controls the weather, and how, too, I found it interesting as I was working on this, how in Bible times they were able to understand the weather to a certain extent. They were able to understand sort of how certain things work. So if we turn over to Job, so in Job 28, we see, and this is Job speaking in this instance, Job 28, verses 23 through 27, it says, God understandeth the way thereof, and he knoweth the place thereof. For he looketh to the ends of the earth, and seeth under the whole heaven, to make the weight for the winds, and he weigheth the waters by measure. When he had made a decree for the rain, and a way for the lightning of the thunder, and he did see it and declare it, he prepared it, yea, and searched it out. So here we see here God has wisdom and power. He knows what's going on. God is in control, and it doesn't necessarily mean God is saying, okay, every single thing has to do this, but he's in control. He knows what's happening with the weather. And if we turn back just a couple pages to Job 26, we have some really powerful images here. In Job 26, verses 8 and 9, we see he bindeth up the waters in his thick clouds, and the cloud is not rent under them. He holdeth back the face of his throne, and spreadeth his cloud upon it. So here, Job this is Job speaking here. He has some understanding of how water works, how the rain works, how clouds work. And I find it really interesting because he says the cloud is not rent under them. So he has this idea of rain, water somehow gets into clouds, but the cloud isn't broken. Like, it does rain, but you still see clouds. It's not like it's always just constantly raining whenever there's clouds around. And so he has this sort of understanding of the water cycle, and I'm sure we all know it, but I'll just sort of briefly explain here how the water cycle works. Water precipitates and rain falls, so it comes down from the cloud. That water then goes into groundwater, lakes, oceans, streams. Then it evaporates either from bodies of water or from plants. And this is something I didn't know, and this is just sort of a little science lesson here. Evaporation from plants is called transpiration, and it's a process by which moisture is carried through plants from roots to small pores on the undersides of leaves, where it changes to vapor and is released to the atmosphere. It's essentially evaporation of water from plant leaves. So doesn't have any necessarily biblical significance there. I just found it interesting, but it also shows how important it is to have plants. It's important to have greenery, to have trees, to have all these things. And that's something that was evident even in Job's time, even in the time of the Bible, where they had famine because of no rain for many years at a time. And then after the evaporation, water condenses in clouds, and then the process starts again, and it kind of keeps going and going and going. And we see in Job 26 here that Job somewhat understands that. He somewhat understands how that's working. And a few chapters farther on, in Job 36, we see some more of this sort of understanding of the water cycle, where Job's friend Elihu is speaking of it. So in Job 36, verse 26 through 33, it says, "Behold, God is great, and we know him." Hang on here, let me read this version. "Behold, God is exalted, and we do not know him. The number of his years is unsearchable, for he draws up the drops of water. They distill rain from the mist, which the clouds pour down. They drip upon man abundantly. Can anyone understand the spreading of the clouds, the thundering of his pavilion? Behold, he spreads his lightning about him. He covers the depths of the sea. For by these he judges people. He gives food in abundance. He covers his hands with the lightning and commands it to strike the mark. Its noise declares his presence, the cattle also concerning what is coming up." So God really does control this rain and thunder and lightning. And even to today, where we have amazing scientific discoveries, we can't control it. We can't control lightning. If we could get lightning somehow, turn it into an electrical source, that would be wonderful to use for powering everything around us. But we still can't control it because it's so powerful and it's so strong. And even here, thousands of years ago, we see that understanding of how rain works, how mist works, how everything kind of has this cycle. And then it continues on into the next chapter, and it says, "And at this my heart trembleth, and is moved out of his place. Hear attentively the noise of his voice, and the sound that goeth out of his mouth. He directeth it under the whole heavens, and his lightning unto the ends of the earth. After it a voice roareth, he thundereth with the voice of his excellency. And he will not say to them with his voice is heard, God thundereth marvelously with his voice. Great things doeth he, which we cannot comprehend. For he saith to the snow, Be thou on the earth, likewise to the small rain, and to the great rain of his strength. He sealeth up the hand of every man, that all men knoweth his work. That the beasts go into dens and remain in their places. Out of the south comes the whirlwind, and the cold out of the north. By the breath of God frost is given, and the breath of the waters is straitened. Also by watering he wearieth the thick cloud, he scattereth his bright cloud, and it is turned round about by his counsel. that they may do whatsoever he commandeth them, upon the face of the world in the earth. He causeth it to come, whether for correction or for his land or for mercy. So here we have this really vivid explanation of how all these different weather cycles are working. You have everything from the breath of God, frost is given, and the breath of the water is straightened. And that's talking about when it gets cold, ice forms. And you have verse 12, and it's turned, speaking of cloud, and it's turned round about by his counsels. You have hurricanes and tornadoes and dust storms and whatnot. And so it's this these words that are so vivid and so explanatory of how God works. It's not something that we just see today in how God is working, but we see back in Job, they understood that as well. And we see God choosing this. We see God choosing where rain falls and where he waters the earth. In Job 5, and I'll just read it here, just a short passage, Job 5, verse 10. Eliphaz, Job's friend, says exactly this of God. He says, he gives rain on the earth and sends water on the fields. And there's many passages through the Bible of this idea of God is sending rain in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, and many other times where God gives rain in due season. So we have the children of Israel doing well, and God lets their land flourish. They're doing poorly, and they don't get rain. And even today we see that. We see in Houston, just a few months ago, we see too much rain. And our modern world could not handle that. People were out of homes. People died. There's problems there. And then at the same time, in the Northwest, we had not enough rain. In Oregon and Washington and California never gets enough rain. But you have this drastic, too much, not enough. And we can't control that even today. So as I was thinking about this and working on my exhortation, I was thinking I thought of a nursery rhyme that many of us know. It doesn't have a author that I can find. It's from some British author at some point. But the nursery rhyme is, whether the weather be fine, or whether the weather be not, whether the weather be cold, or whether the weather be hot, we'll weather the weather, whatever the weather, whether we like it or not. And there's a few other versions of it, but that's the main one that I could find. And that's not biblical necessarily, but there's a lot of good things from that. God's there for us. He's there for us whether the weather is whatever. We don't have control over this. We have to weather it. We can't say, well, I would rather it be cold today and it goes and it's cold. We can't say we need rain today and it goes in rain, because we have to weather the weather, whether we like it or not. But we have something that not everybody has. We have something that allows us to weather that, to go through that, even if we have storms in our lives. And if we have physical storms, I had a tree fall down and destroy a fence in my yard. And I could say, well, that's terrible. Like, I've got to now rebuild that. Or I could say, well, let's see. Use that as a positive thing in my life and use it as a way to get some exercise and enjoy the outside and to interact with my children and to have these many things that we have to have a different perspective on things. And in 1 Kings 19, we have the passage, and we won't turn there, but we have the passage where God comes in he sends various forms. So he sends fire, and he sends an earthquake, but in the end, he comes in that still small voice. But that's not saying God can't come in those. It's not saying God isn't there in the freezing cold temperatures or in the beautiful day outside. God's there in everything. He's in control. And if we have those storms in our lives, we have that time, whether it be physical or mental or spiritual, that we're struggling through. It's not like the weather outside that we just have to bear it and say, well, too bad. We have something to strengthen us and to encourage us. And it's hard, though, like in that 1 Kings passage, it's where God sends some fire and he sends earthquake and it's hard to miss those acts of God. And I find it amusing because that's literally what they're called. If you're insurance, it's called an act of God, that a tree falls on your car. And that's not your fault. That's an act of God. And if you don't believe in God, I wonder how that fits into things. Anyway, but you have these things that it's hard to miss. It's hard to miss these large things in our lives. But do we see those small things? Do we see that still small voice? That beautiful day that you walk outside and you smell the fresh spring grass growing. That's God too. It's not just the terrible storm or the beautiful beach. It's still small things that God is there. And God acts in all sorts of ways. And in the Bible, we have all sorts of ways that we see how God's acting within weather. We see from the very beginning, he caused a flood to cover the earth. And he caused a famine to encourage Joseph's brothers to visit Egypt. He caused the 10 plagues in Egypt. He allowed the children of Israel to pass through the Red Sea. He caused the sun to stand still when the Jews were conquering Israel. He caused a great storm to encourage Jonah to turn around. He caused great fruitfulness and great famine for the children of Israel throughout the years that they were in, throughout the biblical years. He is and was and will always be in control of this world and its weather. And through the Old Testament, we see a lot of these strong, powerful, large acts of God, that God is doing this. He's punishing, he's controlling, he's doing whatnot. We see the law of Moses, that it was written on tablets of stone, that it was enacted and enforced and very strict. And then we have a slight change, and it's not saying any of those are bad, but once we get to the New Testament, we have a different point of view. We have a new way of how these things culminate into something. In Matthew 5, and I'll just turn to it here. In Matthew 5, we have God's control over the weather. So Matthew 5, 43 through 45 says, "You have heard that it has been said, 'Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy.' But I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you, persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust." So God is there. God is working. And it doesn't mean every single thing that happens in our lives is a sign from God. If we walk outside and stub our toe, that doesn't mean God hates us, because it happens to everyone. If we walk outside, if we see somebody that we see as a terrible person and they seem to be doing well, that doesn't mean God is doing well for them, because God does these things for everyone. God is there for everyone. And yet, we still have to make those choices, because we don't know what's happening in that person's lives. We can't be the ones that are judging and say, well, blessing shouldn't be on that person because they aren't doing well. Because we know that it's not just faith, and it's not just works, and it's not just God's grace. It's a combination of all of those that allow us to have that eternal life. We have to ask for forgiveness to be forgiven. So in today's world, sadly, we see many people seeing these natural events and saying that it's God's retribution on them. Whether it be in New Orleans or wherever across the world, we see people saying, God is punishing these people for their evil deeds. But this passage that we read here specifically says, no, that's not the case. God does good on the evil and the just. God does bad on the evil and the just. God is there for everyone, and he's not causing that little rain cloud of badness to happen just on bad people. And a very powerful story of this is the one that we read this morning, the story in Acts 27 where Paul is good. Paul is a good person. The centurion and the Roman soldiers, we don't know that much about them. The centurion seemed to be pretty good at the end, but if you read that whole passage in Acts 27, you see Paul specifically said, we should not go and sail And the centurion said, well, too bad, we're going to do it anyway. And then they had a terrible storm, and all this stuff happened. But it's not God punishing Paul for sailing. It's God using that as a way to grow and strengthen. It's not God punishing us when we have a tree fall on our fence or our house or whatever happens in our lives. It's a way for us to grow and strengthen and be encouraged through that and finding that positive outcome. And the story we read in Acts 27 is like a plot line from a movie. If you read it again, if you have a chance, I strongly encourage you to read that whole passage and look at it from outside of a biblical perspective. Look at it as if you picked up a really interesting book that has short stories, and this is a short story. Because it's all sorts of really crazy things happening. Paul says to the centurion, who, if you know anything about Romans, the Romans were extremely strict, if the reason that the soldiers wanted to kill all of the prisoners is because in Roman law, if a prisoner escaped, a soldier's life had to be taken in direct conjunction with that. And the centurion listened to Paul. He said, okay, we're not going to take that ship. We're not going to take the small ship, even though the storm is terrible, because I trust that you know what God wants for us. And there was 276 people on this boat. And I think it's hard to really understand that. And I don't know how big this boat was, but it probably was not very big. Boats in olden times were not very big. What we see today is large. And I don't know how many people were soldiers or how many were prisoners. But 276, say we have, 50 some odd so here, 75 here. So you have 4 to 5 times the amount of people in this room in a boat, probably not much bigger at all than part of this room. And who knows how they were feeling. They had been shipwrecked or been in this stormy ocean for 2 weeks, feeling probably pretty terrible. And the centurion could have just killed Paul, could have killed everybody that wasn't a Roman, and said, let's just get on with this and see if we can survive. But they had some faith, and they trusted. And then eventually they got to land. And even then, if you keep reading, and we won't turn it there today, but Paul then was bitten by a snake that should have killed him, and it didn't. And they then spent 3 months on this island, which, from what I've researched, was not a very big island. And who knows how many people would have turned to God because of that. So it's something that Paul could have said, I am stuck in this terrible storm. I told the centurion that we shouldn't go sailing, and we did. And I'm going to Rome to probably be killed. And all of these things, and so why should I try? Why should I do anything? But God uses these things in our lives. He uses these terrible storms, whether they be a physical something that happens. Your home's flooded. You have fire destroy your belongings. Or you have something spiritual in your life, that it's a terrible storm, but God is there for us. God works in wonderful and powerful ways, and we don't know. We don't know what that outcome is going to be until we can look back, maybe days, weeks, months, years, and see how God worked in our lives. And so now, as we turn to the memorials, we can see how weather also played a role in Jesus' life and how Jesus interacted with his disciples. In Luke 12, verses 54 through 56, we see it says, and he said to the people, when you see a cloud rise out of the west, straightway you say, there cometh a shower, and so it is. And when you see a south wind blow, you say, there will be heat, and it cometh to pass. Ye hypocrites, ye can discern the face of the sky and the earth, but how is it that you do not discern this time? So Jesus is accusing these and those around him that they're being blind to the actuality of their situation. They have the Messiah, the Son of God, standing in front of them, and they can say, well, it's going to rain tomorrow because I know what it always has done. But they weren't listening to the Old Testament, the words that they knew of, here's what the Messiah is going to be like, here's what he's going to do, and they weren't listening. And how is it easy for us to do that? How we can say, well, We can look at the weather reports and say, well, I know this is going to happen. Or if you're working finances, you can say, well, I know this is going to happen. Or whatever you do, you can say, well, I know this is going to happen. But do we do that with our own lives? Do we do that with our spiritual lives? Do we do that with those around us? Can we say, well, I see Joe Schmo hasn't been coming to work or hasn't been coming to meeting, but he's probably okay. Like, I don't need to spend time with that. I don't need to spend time working and encouraging them. Or in our own lives, we say, I've been struggling spiritually. I don't feel very connected to God, but hey, I don't have time for that. But we make time for these other things. We make time to make sure we bring a raincoat, or we bring something to scrape our snow off from the car. We have these opportunities in our normal lives, but we don't necessarily put that into our spiritual life. And today we see signs of the times. We see Christ's imminent return as a very near possibility. But do we plan for that? Because we plan for our vacations. We get things ready, we pack up, we make sure we get the time off work. We plan for our jobs. We know that, hey, I'm hoping to get a raise, or I'm hoping to be able to do this project down the road, so I need to get these things prepared. We plan for school. From a young age, we tell children they need to go to school because they need to then go to high school and then college, and then that's how they're going to get a good job. But do we do that with our spiritual lives? Do we say we need to go? And I think we do. I'm not saying we're not doing these things, but I think we do. But do we take it as seriously? Do we say we go to Sunday school because that's going to prepare you to hopefully get baptized and to hopefully be a strong member of your ecclesia? But do we take that as a higher priority than those things in our lives that we have as the weather around us, as we have that goal of going to school or getting a good job or having a good family or whatever it may be? Because we need to, because we have very evident here in Luke where Jesus says, you're hypocrites. You tell this by the sky and the earth, but you can't discern the time that's around you. You can't discern that our world is going downhill, whether it be quickly or slowly, it's going downhill. In Mark 4, we have a very evident weather-related interaction from Jesus. And that hymn we sung just previous to this, it really brings it to life. It brings it to, this interaction was so powerful. So I'll just read it in Mark 4, verse 35 to 41. It says, "And the same day, when the even was come, he saith unto them, Let us pass over unto the other side. And when they had sent away the multitude, they took him, even as he was, in the ship. And there were also with him other little ships. And there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves beat into the ship, so that it was now full. And he was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow. And they awake him, and say unto him, Master, carest thou not that we perish? And he arose and rebuked the wind, and said unto the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said unto them, Why are ye so fearful? How is that you have no faith? And they feared exceedingly, and said one to another, What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? So Jesus knew that they were going to weather that storm. He knew that they were going to get through that. He had faith. But he also knew that his disciples needed to learn and be strengthened. He could have said, well, let's just wait. Let's just wait overnight and we'll leave in the morning. And then this interaction would never have had to come to pass. And just think of those disciples. They are the ones, many of them knew what the storms would be like. They knew how terrible the weather could be in the Sea of Galilee. If you look at a map or you look into what this place is like, large storms could come up quickly. It's basically a bowl of sorts with the Sea of Galilee in the bottom of it. And things could come up very quickly and be very disastrous, even though it's a rather small sea, or a large lake, basically. But you can imagine that fear and the frustration and anger through the disciples as they struggled with this storm. They said, "Why, Jesus? Why did you have us do this?" And do we do that in our own lives? Do we say, "Why? Why is this happening in our own lives? Why are we having to go through this?" But there is a reason. And he rose and said, "Peace, be still. Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" And in Matthew, in the same instance, he says, "Oh, ye of little faith." And obviously both are great versions, but I like the Matthew passage because it speaks slightly differently to me. It speaks that they did have some faith. It wasn't that they had no faith at all. It wasn't that they were completely lacking, but they had little faith. And that's so easy in our lives to have little faith. That we say, that we know that God is there. Hopefully we know that, and hopefully we trust that. But do we have full faith in that? Can we fully put our trust in him? And so Jesus is not accusing them of being worthless and hopeless, but he's encouraging them to have faith. He's encouraging them to grow through this and to be strengthened through this. So in this moment is possibly one that Jesus would have looked back on in the Garden of Gethsemane, a moment where he's speaking to his future self, encouraging himself to have faith and to weather that storm. He's encouraging himself to be strengthened because we know, and he knew, that his sacrifice of his perfect life was necessary and pivotal in God's plan. So when we're struggling, when the storms of life are overpowering us, when we feel like the earth beneath our feet is shaking and that there's fires threatening to overtake us, when that painful rain of self-doubt, fear, and discouragement is drenching us with bitter cold or scorching heat, is causing us to want to give up on that straight and narrow path, we must remember those three simple words that Jesus used to calm the storms surrounding him. Peace, be still. If we have faith in Jesus, his sacrifice, and the eternal life that it grants us, all those storms around us will be calmed. The cold will be abated, the fires will be put out, and we will have true peace.